Hello, my name is Nicole Milavetz. Thanks for the introduction. It's always weird having your bio read out loud to you. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the Utah Desert and the work of the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, as well as working in the conversation about our moral imperative and what we talk about and think about when we talk through the climate crisis. So we'll get going. So kind of in a nutshell, SUWA's work, SUWA stands for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, is tirelessly protecting wilderness quality land in the Utah desert. We'll look through kind of the different areas in the state we're working to protect and our focal piece of legislation that we use to do so. But for this session especially, I wanted to take a few moments just to touch on the moral imperative question. And I think for me, it breaks down into three parts. The first being helping to mitigate the effects of the climate crisis. Personally, I see the act of designating wilderness and protecting wilderness as a way to mitigate the effects of the climate crisis. And this is SUWA's belief. When we protect large landscapes, we retain carbon sequestration benefits, we provide habitat and provide habitat for really critical we provide habitat for critically endangered and endemic species, as well as protecting cultural sites for Indigenous communities. And then kind of the third area I want to touch on is this idea of designating wilderness as an act of humility. I think that protecting wilderness and working on wilderness is a way to sit with the land. It's a way to be in a give and take relationship with the land instead of just a take. And it's kind of a way that we can set ourselves up for success when we talk about the climate crisis and what our future looks like. So I'm going to see if I can click through. These are just a couple of pictures of the Utah desert and lands that my conservation group is working to protect. Some beautiful sites. Sort of the main piece of SUWA's work centers around America's Red Rock Wilderness Act. So this is a citizen's proposal for designating close to 8.2 million acres of wilderness across the state of Utah. You can see the majority of land is, one second, you can see the majority of land is in southern Utah, as well as the West Desert. And a lot of these areas in southern Utah are sort of filling in the pieces and spaces in between our national parks and national monuments. And this kind of goes into this idea we'll touch on further, but the idea of landscape connectivity. So when we protect huge swaths of wilderness quality land, we are creating a connected landscape. We are creating land that is able to really properly sequester carbon and provide critical habitat and protect cultural sites, and also really showing that when we protect broad landscapes, incredible things happen for our state in general from an ecological standpoint. So yeah, this is a citizens inventory, and a lot of our work focuses around this. We introduced this piece of legislation at a national level to build robust support for this act across the country, kind of going into that idea that these are public lands for all Americans to be a part of that movement. So moving along. Oops. I forgot for this one, I have to click through quickly. I want to touch on the clarification of wilderness designation. When I began my role at SUWA, I wasn't entirely sure. Oops, I got to go back. What classified as wilderness and what didn't. So, wilderness is designated at a congressional level, and has a piece of land must fit these criteria in order to be considered and designated as wilderness. So having minimal human imprint is really important. We can't be working to designate lands that are already completely developed. This is kind of why we feel a race against the clock when we talk about the climate crisis, when we talk about wilderness preservation. Once a piece of land has extractive uses on it, is being overconsumed, it no longer fits this criteria of minimal human imprint. And so that would strip its ability to be designated as wilderness. And then opportunities for unconfined recreation. We'll talk about this a bit more later on, but primitive examples of recreation include walking, backpacking, and really recreating responsibly in these areas. A parcel of land needs to be at least 5,000 acres in size, and it needs to be largely a roadless area. And then it needs to have educational, scientific, and historical and cultural value. And this is, based on kind of where the land is and what we're talking about, this can be more of a flexible definition as well. Something I want to bring up, let's talk about climate change right here in Utah. I know our keynote was talking this morning about the Great Salt Lake. That's a very large problem we're facing in the Salt Lake City Valley. And kind of when we look at Utah as a whole, we sit in a really unique position in our state because we have a lot of wilderness quality public lands, and we're also a large contributor to the climate crisis with those extractive uses. And I think this kind of goes into that idea of, our moral responsibility. We in Utah are in a really unique position, and we kind of get to be in a more of a deciding role of how we want to use these spaces, how we want to protect them, and kind of what our responsibility is to that, to the earth, to each other, to the environmental movement, and to future generations. So I'm now going to touch on a few examples of what's happening on our public lands and kind of these efforts that SUWA is taking to remediate. So we're frequently our own worst enemy. Upsetting statistic is that the U.S. is losing a football field of functioning habitat at the rate of every 30 seconds. This is an example of when we prioritize unconfined recreation over conservation. The two terms aren't interchangeable. Recreation is important. It's important for folks to be able to recreate on public lands, and also conservation is sort of even more important when we look at the climate crisis and the situation that we as a society are currently in. So this is an example of excessive ORV use, off-road vehicle usage on public lands, and really needing to strike a thoughtful balance between conservation and recreation, and make sure we have some areas for folks to recreate on, some trails and pathways to recreate, but allowing people to recreate wherever they want, whenever they want, however they want, at the risk of these critical riparian ecosystems and at the risk of cultural sites and habitat for animals is not the right choice. This is an example of a practice happening on public lands called chaining. This involves essentially the clear cutting of pinyon pine forests, which are the most common forests in southern Utah. So this practice involves having a weighted chain dragged between two tractors and essentially clear cutting these forests. This is largely to make the ground more amenable for cattle and ranching practices. And so this is something that SUWA has engaged in a lot of litigation against to really make sure that we're preserving these pinyon pine, juniper groves, and all the habitat that they provide for the Utah desert. I want to talk for a few moments just about animals in the Utah desert. When we think about the desert, maybe big animals and migratory pathways aren't the first thing that come to mind. And, since beginning my role at SUWA and learning about the Utah desert, this has been a really beautiful wake-up call. So we have the desert tortoise here. We have a beautiful burrowing owl. And yeah, we're in quite the state when we talk about our bird populations and animal populations in general. And so kind of moving on to this next slide, a lot of the work that ARWA, America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, and the work SUWA is doing is to protect these migratory pathways. So we see large mammals migrating from the Sawtooth Range, the Tetons, Yellowstone, Rocky Mountain National Park, and kind of the high alpine in Colorado, the San Juans in southern Colorado, all the way through Utah. So it's pretty incredible that we have 5 major migratory pathways just within our state. And some of these animals that are migrating, mule deer, pronghorn, elk, black bears. I've personally never seen a black bear in the desert and would love to. And so passing America's Red Rock Wilderness Act really is a step in the right direction to protecting habitat for these animals. This is another beautiful shot of your public lands, you know, America's public lands, and kind of the work we're doing to protect them. Just think this photo is really stunning. Whoops. I want to take a few moments to talk about the biological soil crust. In the past, you've maybe heard it called the cryptobiotic soil. It's recently been renamed. And, you know, protecting the Utah desert also involves protecting this soil. This is a living soil that provides support for plants and animals. One of the most important things it does is hold moisture and controlling dust. You know, it's no surprise to anybody that the Western United States is in a drought. We, you know, talk about drought when we talk about the Great Salt Lake as well. And so protecting this biological soil and holding moisture in for these desert ecosystems that don't need quite as much water as, you know, some of the coniferous forests we have in northern Utah is really important. And when we talk about dust control, you know, extractive uses destroy the biological soil crust and kick up a lot of dust. This dust then is transposed over across state borders, you know, into Colorado on those mountain ranges, which really exacerbates the melting happening in the spring, which kind of leads to major floods happening and then pushing us further and further into those drought conditions. So when we don't use this land extractively, when we protect it, we're having less dust storms, we're having less snow on, or less dust on major snowpacks, which is leading to less flooding and then drought conditions. And also, you know, this is kind of a recent misperception is when we think about protecting the Utah desert, you know, some of the questions I'll get is what's there? Why? What's the point in protecting it? You know, and so SUWA is working really hard to kind of change this misperception that desert ecosystems lack the capacity to store carbon. The desert is a major carbon sink, and it's a major carbon sink if the landscape is intact, you know, and healthy. So pinyon, pine, juniper groves store immense amounts of carbon. The biological soil crust stores immense amounts of carbon. And this is, you know, still a new practice where I'm really interested and excited to see more and more novel science coming out about this, looking at the desert and the protection of the desert as a tool to mitigate the effects of the climate crisis. Yeah, and I kind of just wanted to touch on, you know, the work that SUWA is doing with Indigenous communities. I think that we, you know, protecting wilderness includes the protection of cultural resources and access that Indigenous communities have had to this land. And when we talk about the wilderness movement, I think, you know, it's more vital than ever to elevate and support Indigenous communities and their voices and their wishes. You know, upcoming will be the Bears Ears Management Plan will be coming out shortly. And, you know, it's more important than ever to really let Indigenous communities and leaders be the leaders in that space and offer what we can as an environmental nonprofit to really help support that mission and that vision, and also know when we don't need to necessarily be the number one leader in that fight and conversation. And I think that goes, you know, back into this conversation of our moral imperative when we talk about wilderness and the history of the environmental movement and how we can move forward and really incorporate environmental justice. You know, I believe wilderness preservation and designation need to be part of the conversation for environmental justice and climate justice. And I think working with Indigenous communities is a great way to do that. SUWA has the support of the Hopi Nation and the Navajo Nation on America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, which is pretty incredible. And we're working as much as possible with Indigenous communities to continue to elevate those voices. Let's see. Yeah, and so this is the last slide I have, and I guess I just wanted to thank everybody for letting me come and chat about wilderness preservation and our movement. We are, you know, largely a grassroots movement. We believe any and all people should be involved in our movement, and if you're interested in getting involved and learning more about SUWA's mission, please check out our website or feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and thank you all so much for letting me connect today.